All right. Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And today my guest is Dan Pontefract. I am pronouncing that correctly, right?
Yes, you got it right. So we're already off to a good start, Nola.
I was practicing earlier. So, Dan, if you don't happen to know him, he is the author of now five books, one of which is coming out in October. Canada gets precedence, everybody else gets November. And he's done four TED Talks, and he is actually representing the West Coast here in Victoria, right?
I'm in Victoria, BC, the better coast, sometimes we call it.
Ah, well, I try to make sure I've got representation from across Canada. So I've got now two BC people representing on my podcast. I do have to get the prairies in at some point. So maybe you'll have to hook me up with
I
somebody
can
like
help
that.
you with that.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly. That'd be great. So Dan has written a book which is called Work Life Bloom. And that's very interesting to me because as I shared with him in an email, if you know anything about my personal story, my life has been a cycle of entertainment, shifting between work and life. For example, in 2018, I had a massive car accident because I had pneumonia because of overwork and shut down the DVP. I destroyed my car, made a million people late for work, and yeah, so it went fun for there. But that was a time when work was going amazingly. I'd been invited actually by the CEO and executive vice president of our division to actually present about busting silos. And I was going down to the city to actually step into what I thought was going to be the next part of my career. And life prevented me from that, from prevented that from happening. Right. So for me, I've noticed this cycle a long time. And so to actually see your book kind of illustrate that and really bring to life with a beautiful metaphor. I've noticed in your work you have this gift of picking up these beautiful metaphors. So I'm interested to see what you've got going on with this. Now, for example, how did you actually start with the concept of there's no such thing as work-life balance?
Well,
Bit
first
of
of all,
contrary.
yeah, what a harrowing journey that you've taken. So my hat tips to you and how you continue to persevere and shine a light on resilience. So good on you, Nola, first and foremost. And again, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
Um, Work Life Bloom started out as a book that I thought was about agency and solely agency. And why agency? And it expanded from there. And how did work life balance become sort of the antichrist that I honed in on? And effectively, agency was a path I was going down because what was going into the pandemic to me was quite evident that many of us, whether you're a leader or non-leader, felt as though that both in work and life we had lost agency, we had lost direction, we had lost um, the worth of self, which is in essence an offspring to agency. Agency is really about that self-determination, that why am I here, and do I have and am I empowered to make decisions that fuel both work and life, in that sense of agency of worth. And as I began to really dig deep into the word, both the noun and the verb of agency, I realized that there was more to it than just agency. And so as I began to unpack that, I said, well, what's kind of at the root right now of why people are in angst? Why are they feeling as though, both work and life, and the data that I had collected to that point, not even my own, by the way, I did do primary research after I decided not to go right down the path of agency, that there was more to it. The data was telling me, whether it was Gallup or McKinsey or Deloitte or whatever, that both people, human beings at work and life, effectively had become disillusioned, and it had been increasing going into the pandemic. There was a blip during the pandemic, particularly, March 2020 through to about January 2021, where organizations and leaders actually took an empathy pill and uh, decided that they could do it. So there was a lot more empowerment, a lot more agency, certainly a lot more of these work-life factors that I honed in on. But then it evaporated. And so here I was, having written a book called Lead Care Win, that I wrote 75% of it prior to the pandemic. And I was thinking about agency, but they didn't make its way into that book because I have ideas and they kind of get tabled in my little Evernote. And I have about 18 ideas or 18 books on the go at all times. So it's kind of like cross piecing things. Anyway, so Lead Care Win comes out in October of 2020. I'm actually semi happy, not just because of the book, but because there's a care and an empathy going on with leaders. But then, as I mentioned, 2021, Nola turns around, and all of a sudden we were going back to our old ways. I mean, leaders were going back to their old ways. And so then I'm like, oh, what's happening again? So again, agency comes up. I look at it. It's like, no, there's more to it. And then throughout 2021, I realized that I needed to dig deeper on what was actually at the root cause. And so some things emerged. Work-life balance being an utter myth, if not utter BS. It's sort of a zero-sum game to begin with. Number two, I realized that there were a lot of people I was interviewing because I went back and did research of my own research, looked at my own research. Then I started to do global research, that when leaders or organizations, Nola, ask people to, quote, bring their most authentic selves or best selves to work, it's like, well, what are you doing to help them with that? You can't just say that, because that means they have something from life that they need to be bringing in. If you're not helping either that part or working on the work factors that allow them to take the work back into their life and feel like a human being, well, shame on you. So that was myth number two. And then myth number three, I realized, it hit me on a bike ride, to be honest. And that was like firms like Blessing White and Gallup and Great Place to Work, like the employee engagement score. You know, there's FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that's issued by these big consulting firms to senior leaders and organizations, particularly the C-suite, to say, look, employee engagement stuck at 30% or stuck at X%. It's been like this for 20 years. You're terrible, you leader. And I was like, wait a second. I bought into that myth too for years as a senior executive in various firms. So why is employee engagement scoring stuck? And what I realized on this bike ride was that we keep asking the same questions, but they are moments in time for the employee.
Yep.
So when you asked me an employee engagement question when it was 2005, I might have been a very different person in my work and life factors. And then maybe 10 years later, working for another organization, maybe I now have a family, maybe I lost a family member, I'm not sure, but maybe something happened and my employee engagement score is different than 10 years ago. But Gallup and Blessing White and Aon, they don't tell you that. They just say, we flatlined our scores, you're terrible organization and leaders.
And your people just don't have best friends at work.
Exactly. So work-life balance, authentic selves, and employee engagement became the myths. And I was like, there's something behind this. And it's not just agency. It was a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's what happened and how the book got written.
Okay, no, that's excellent. And so you have another contrarian view, which is about the future of work. And your view is that the future of work actually isn't in the future, it's actually starting now.
Exactly. I mean, again, here I was many years talking on stage in workshops, you know, even as an executive at places like SAP and TELUS about, quote, the future of work. And what it unfortunately did was to tie leaders to thinking about the future and not today. And so if you want a better future, you have to focus on today. So my whole point of Work-Life Bloom is to say, what are those work-life factors today that you need to be working on in your organization, on your team, et cetera, for the team member and yourself to feel some sort of residual benefit downstream, ergo the future. So the future of work is, to me now, because if you're not making the right modifications today, the future doesn't even matter. And I think that's what my data and other people's data suggest, with stress, anxiety, burnout, anger, sadness, loneliness, all of it catapulting in a very negative way over the past decade. And this was happening before the pandemic. It's exacerbated by the pandemic. So this whole future of work adage clearly was not working if all of the data suggests that people are melting in both work and life. So yeah, I'm a contrarian to that point of view as well.
Okay, no, that's good. But I think that's a perfect time for you to actually maybe show us the grid.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So
That way
if
we
you're
can put it in
listening,
context.
yeah, if you're listening, I'll explain it verbally. So imagine, first of all, an X and a Y axis. And on the X axis is life, on the Y axis is work. And why I do this is because, as I say in the book, you cannot separate work from life, yet work-life balance is a zero-sum game. So we need to be thinking about how life is integrated with work, work is integrated with life, in so much that they are different beasts. Like, I don't suggest in the book, by the way, that work is separated from life, or is separated from life. I'm sorry. Work is something that we do, but when we say work is just a part of our life, then again, we're setting ourselves up for a zero-sum game. So, work on the y-axis, life on the x-axis, and my point is this. So, what if, just very simply, life had a range between very clear, so my character, my attributes of what I am as a human being, that's what the life factors are, between clear and confusing. So somewhere in there, there's a range. But on the work or the y-axis, what if work was somewhere between amazing and awful? we have to remember, Nola, that life comes into work and work comes into life. So as a leader, thinking about my team members, whether you have a team of 5 or 500, everyone comes to work with things from their life, but then they bring their work into their lives later on. So I argue there's a fiduciary responsibility for you as a leader thinking about where people are in both their work and their life. So let's hypothetically say that work's going awful and life is kind of confusing. I argue that you're in need of renewal. So we'll get to the factors, both the work and the life factors, but when your boss or your team or your organization just isn't clicking, there's something there. But then your life attributes, your life factors, the things that make you a human being are also not really clicking, and thus you're confused. You're definitely in need of renewal. The second of 4 personas I'm suggesting is called stunted. So when life is very clear with the life factors that we'll get to that seem like you've got 5 or 6 of those 6 life factors, in a positive means, but the work side is not going so hot for you, it's kind of awful, let's just say, then you're stunted. And when you're stunted, that means that you need some work on the work factors. The flip side of that, of course, is when life and your life factors, your character factors, aren't really clear, so thus they're confusing, but work feels amazing, we'll get to why, then I argue you're budding. And this why you're budding is that you're close to the final persona, but you ultimately need some help, and that is where a leader can come in. And of course, the book is called Work-Life Bloom, so not surprisingly, the final persona is called blooming, and that's when both work and life are kicking it. It's just awesome. So just let me quickly talk about the 6 work factors and the 6 life factors, because then we can dovetail from there.
Okay.
So Nola, what I discovered in my primary research was that there are certain factors that team members need or desire for them to feel fulfilled at work, which leads towards the blooming phase. And those factors are, I got to have a trusting environment. I got to feel like I belong. I have to be valued by my team and my boss. There has to be a purpose in that organization, if not team. I need to understand the strategy, and not just once a year through one PowerPoint deck. And there has to be reciprocal norms which is really the culture factor, right? Like, so that we collaborate, that we are aware of our processes, that I'm not confused ultimately about things on the work side. And then lastly, on the life factors, again, like characters. So what's my sense of meaning that I can bring into my work through life? What's my relationships in life? But also often we find that the most number of relationships people have are tied to their work. So what am I doing to build those up? My well-being. So is my boss, is my organization not taking care of my well-being, at least interested in it, so that when I go back, quote, to life, that I am well? And then the last three, is someone helping me with my skills, like the development of me into a greater, better, different person? There's where agency pops up, the fifth of the six, right? So that's where it tucked in and where this whole journey of blooming started. So do I have self-determination and thus agency? And then finally, am I respected? So when I enter the community after a day's work, am I respected for who I am? Or am I disrespected because of some of the things that are happening to me at work that I'm transferring over to life? So there you go. That's the model in sum.
And in some of your data, you actually said that it's what, 60% of people who actually need help getting to the blooming stage?
Well, I just so happened to have thought you might ask something like that. Here's so the global results, first of all, just under 10,000 people. So just about 5,000 leaders, 5,000 non-leaders across 11 countries, Nola. So I wasn't messing around when I said I really wanted to do primary global research this time. And so you're right. 41% of those that were surveyed and assessed find themselves in the blooming phase, which is pretty good, I guess, with the other 60 odd percent, 59% in one of the other three personas. So again, my point in the book is that, you might take this assessment, which is free, by the way, for anyone now, and it might be different in a year's time or 2 years' time. The point of the work-life bloom assessment is to say, well, where are people right now? But what is it that's failing on some of those work and or life factors that then a leader or the senior leadership team need to be thinking about, so that we might help people in that particular phase of their work and or life to become a blooming individual.
And the breakdown by gender was interesting as
I
well,
got
too.
that too. That's so funny. Thanks for asking. It's as though we
It's like we're the
rehearsed
same
this.
person.
Well, it's like we rehearsed this, but anyway. And I also have leader, non-leader, if you want to ask that next. But
Okay,
so
yeah.
for those listening in, again, the breakdown was basically a 50-50 split between females and males. And yes, we just for the record, we did ask non-gender individuals, but we got such a low sample size that we are not reporting on that, just to be very clear. So from a male perspective, 50% of males are, quote, blooming, yet it drops somewhat precipitously for females down to 32%, which is saying something in the data about what it is that we need to be thinking about that can create these work-life factors better, not just for all team members, but for females in particular. An 18-point difference between males, that to me is sad and frightening. So we need to do something about that. And then the last one I'll show you, and I'll shut up, is the leaders versus non-leaders, which again paints a pretty good picture. Well, not a good one. So only, if you will, 48% of leaders are, quote, blooming, with another 52% in the other personas. But it drops for non-leaders to 26%. And so given that we did survey 50% leaders, 50% non, and you see this drop like this, it's rather telling and sad, because what non-leaders are telling us is that we need more help from our leader to help us in this kind of work-life imbalance, and thus the integration that we're talking about here.
Now, with gender inequity in the workplace, is there a correlation between the female and the non-leaders?
So there is a slight bump from female leaders to female non-leaders in the blooming versus non-blooming. And I can get that to you in the show notes if you want, but I know
Sure.
there is a difference, and it is female leaders are definitely higher in blooming than non-female leaders, but it is a definite drop, again, female non-leaders in terms of blooming or not.
And was there a further correlation with caregivers?
Yeah, and that's the thing. So I identify actually this part in the book when we're talking about certain life factors, such as well-being, such as agency, such as respect. I make the point that because I guess one thing I want to be clear also about is I ask three subjective questions. So, anecdotal. And I mean, we received, I think it was like 21,000 unique comments that we had to sift through as well through the, almost 10,000 people. And when you kind of do the mining of that data and you start digging into identified by female, identified by caregiver, identified by parent, and or identified by what they said in the comments related to that, gosh, Nola, the number of females and or mothers that came out and said, gosh, I wish my employer would understand better the nightmare that I have to deal with, given I'm raising kids, given that I'm trying to integrate my work and my life. I'm trying to be there for both. And so it really was painful to go through, but it also enlightened me and informed me as to what particularly male leaders need to be thinking about differently as they are more empathic towards what females have to endure between their work and their lives. And you know what, actually, so, I know we're recording today in sort of mid-June-ish, but there are several very large multinational companies that are sort of forcing their people back into the office.
Yes.
And whether BIPOC and or caregivers, there's some serious issues that these mostly white male senior leaders are suggesting, as if like we weren't, as I mentioned during the kind of the pandemic era, we weren't doing well before. And so just to make people come in for the sake of, I just need to see you work, hammering away on a keyboard, to me says more about the trust factor of the work factor, right? And the fact that these senior leaders are not trusting females enough that they need to be in the office 4 or 5 days straight, like we were pre-pandemic. It's crazy. Like, it's just nuts.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also related to respect. So it's not only do they not trust them, but it's do they respect the life experience that those people are sharing.
It's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. And so, like, for me, that's why these 12 factors. So if I summarize right again, like the 6 work factors, the 6 life, that's why they're integral. They're related. They're integrative, if you will. And so to get to be blooming, as I mentioned in the book and the research that we did to come up with the model, you need 5 or 6 of the work factors and 5 or 6 of the life factors in any combination. But that's why, if like we were seeing in some of the correlated results, that often trust and respect are together. Now, if trust and respect were off on both sides, both the work and the life factor, sorry, and then you just needed one of the other factors to be sort of negative, then the thing falls apart. So that's why you can see, I need to feel trusted at work, but I need to feel respected in life. If I'm not respected in life, i.e. the ability for me to work from home 4 days a week, and I'll come in one because, my job is a desk job and half the time I'm on Zoom anyway, so why should I be in the office? I can help my family. That's the respect piece that we're looking for in life, which relates to the trust factor at work.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting because, and again, I know you don't know me very well, but before my role was restructured, I actually founded an employee resource group for parenting and caregiving.
Huh.
Because I knew this was coming because I'd lived it since 2012. And that's where I'm actually leading into your comments about employee activism. If leaders are not actually taking the initiatives to trust and respect and invest in people and make sure that they've got what they need to be successful in both life and work, what's the end result going to be if people are not getting that support?
So there's that dreary question, if I go tangentially to, I need a paycheck. I need to be able to feed my kids, pay the mortgage, the rent, go on the odd holiday, and so forth. With how am I being treated at my place of work, which extends, as I keep mentioning, right into my life. Like the factors will, spill over. So I I can I can see where team member activism, employee activism can play a part in shaking the tree, if you will, with leaders in an organization when they're completely in a buffoonery style, unaware of what's actually happening, in the trenches, in the with the foot soldiers. So examples, like Netflix
Mm.
and team members basically saying to their CEO, why did we sign Dave Chappelle? What is this stand-up bit that he's doing? He's basically talking smack and nonsense about LGBTQ plus community. Do we believe in this? And their employee activism basically said to the senior leader, and particularly the CEO, WTH, what the hell? Why what are we doing? Now, what it did was it forced the CEO of Netflix to come out and say, "You're right. I handled this terribly. I shouldn't have been so you know, essentially curt with my comments." Because he basically came out and said, "Your employees, you don't have a say in decisions like whether we sign Dave Chappelle or not to a comedy special." But what it did was it forced the CEO to say to himself, in this case, "Whoops, I'm an idiot. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry." And he apologized, which then hopefully plants a seed, I guess perhaps pun intended, for the next time that CEO has to be thinking about what type of decisions can be made and how he might, or she, include people in some of that decision making, or at least opinions, before decisions are made.
Well, and it's also living those values as well, too. So, for an example, the cast of Outer Banks is actually supposed to be filmed in what, North Carolina or South Carolina, and they're not filming there because of the state legislation is not supportive,
And we
right?
can use that example and just, down the coast a little bit into Florida, and what Disney is having to do with the Governor
Yes,
DeSantis at this time in terms of various humanity and humane rights. So that's something that's going to play out obviously in the courts, and Disney is going to have to figure out a way to stand its ground despite what DeSantis is trying to do from a legislation perspective. It's just an abomination of human rights, clearly.
right.
But there's a business activism, and thus, because employees already spoke to Disney and said, "Hey, WTH again," right?
Yes.
So the CEO and team over there at Disney are, in for a fight against the government of the state of Florida.
And that's where it's interesting, too, because legislation isn't necessarily always in the best interest of employees, right? So there's two sides of it. Obviously, you want legislation is going to support your employees, but when legislation exists that isn't, where do you stand? And I think that's where a lot of employees are looking for their employees to actually step up and take a stand.
Yeah, and there's this now new kind of balance, right? What executives are having to think about, like what's the business consequence of sticking up for a human right, which is
Right.
just terrible place to be for society, particularly in certain countries. Like, for example, when I read that companies have put together essentially a play deck, like a playbook that goes through the decision making processes of whether or not they should publicly respond to something that has happened in the public writ large.
Are we
And
talking base
they're,
camp?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's terrifying, the fact that, C suites have to now decide how, and I don't like the term, but they basically are putting together well, how woke can we be
Mm.
versus like the business consequences. And it's not about woke. That term has been stolen somewhat obviously. It's about thinking through the right humanity based decisions. Like, you are we not all humans? like, so back to trust and respect, right? So for kind of the work-life bloom model, if you're an employee or even a customer, but if you're an employee and you see that your C-suite is not sticking up for something that is inherently wrong, how would you feel in your work-life factors, particularly when it comes to things like respect and trust or purpose and meaning? Like it falls by the wayside pretty quickly, hence the point of view then falling into budding, stunted, or renewal if you kind of look at the model.
Right. And people, that's where you get the internal videos that are then released, and it becomes a public relations nightmare.
I mean, when you have a returning CEO from a telecom high-tech company suggesting that he loves dogs, but I'm so glad that someone got rid of their dog to work harder, you gotta ask yourself, like, what sort of street cred from a humane perspective does someone have like that?
Yeah, exactly. And then when you become a meme and it's pity city,
Yeah.
and how is that endemic of like your your brand? Like it's going to be constantly linked to your name as a leader going forward. Is that what you want your legacy to be? And that
Mhm.
really is what it comes down to, is like the future might be now, but it is going to live on, right? So how do we get people to get closer to blooming, leaders included?
Well, I mean, that's such a tough nut to crack, but that's why I wrote the book. And I think you have to look at and assess your leadership, your organization's culture, the way in which that it's not or it is affecting these six work and these six life factors. And again, there's lots of organizations that are already doing this. And again, by virtue of the fact that when I see in the global data that we did, 41% of people are blooming, and we've now, since we released this assessment globally, just without the focus groups, we got another 1,200 people that have taken the free assessment, and the data is basically the same. So it's just a little bit shorter. It's about 37% right now, people blooming. So there are examples of organizations that and or teams, right, and leaders that look at the six work and life factors and say, okay, trust. What do we got right here? Do we trust? What are how we making that happen? Are we consistent with it? And polling their teams, asking them, are we trusted? Like, tell me, like, what's going wrong? And the ones that are more open and asking the factors of belonging, of are we valued? Are you valued? Do you feel valued? Do you understand the strategy? Like, again, having conversations and assessing where the teams are, the organization are on both of those work and life factors does wonders for whether or not they are trying to create the right conditions for those team members to bloom.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that you said conversations, because it's not just about anonymous surveys. It's about building that connection and actually making people feel that they've got a voice so that they can influence what that future is going to be.
This is exactly it. I mean, at the end of the day, when a leader is trusting, they're going to have open communication. When people feel they belong, they know that there is a conversation that can be had at any point. When they feel valued, they know that recognition and endorsement and thus open communication is happening. When they understand the strategy, there's communication happening. When there is purpose going on, there's a reinforcement of that. What's that? That's an open door of where are we going and how do we operate. When the norms are affected, I'm obviously going through all six of the work factors, right? When the norms feel as though that it's not friction or sandpaper or nails on a chalkboard to get stuff done, there's a dialogue about what's working, what's not between the leader and the team. So that's just the six work factors. It's all about the openness, the coaching conversations, the quote open door policy, and just the way in which that the mechanisms of the team are set up so that there's dialogue. There's a like the Greek agora is another way to look at this. The Greek agora, a wonderful little metaphor of which anyone could just walk around in the agora and they just pontificate and ponder, and they get on a little soapbox and they'd yell at each other, but they talk about it. It's like it was open. Why don't we have ourselves a Greek agora, Nola?
Isn't that what Slack is? Sorry.
A Greek Slack, yes.
A Greek Slack. You would be safe enough to actually make sure that it's being recorded. Question for you. You tell a story about a retirement party that you went to when you were actually still at TELUS, and you told a story about this woman who had been with the company for 40 years, and she gave you advice about finding your people and to make sure that you always have people that you can relate to and how important that is. And I thought it was a beautiful story, but I also have worked for Canadian companies that are older than a century. And what I find is that that's actually disengaging for some people because not everybody makes it to the retirement. So I was at the company for 17 and a half years before they decided to restructure my role. Um, you know, and you've seen it with companies throughout the pandemic too, where they're actually doing like mass layoffs via email. So you mentioned at one point in your book, which I thought was interesting too, it's about the alumni. So it's not just the retirees, but any employee that you've had within your purview. You probably actually had many more employees who worked for you over the years than just that retiree group. So do you think that we actually need to revisit how we celebrate the people who've contributed to our success over the years?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. And the mic drop answer is uh, swear word yes. So I've lived by an adage, which I don't know where I picked it up from. I don't know if I invented it or it just stuck with me, but this was like 20 years ago. And it is as follows: my network is my net worth. And when, like a garden, you tend to the network, as I point out in the relationships life factor, which I do believe the leader has a fiduciary responsibility to help the team member tend to their garden of relationships, life just feels that much smoother. I think you have a more bountiful garden, if you will, when relationships are thought of as needing to be tended to. So I agree. I've been fired before as well. And that's not fun when you're suddenly cut from what was, your relationships. But instead of wearing a scarlet letter of being fired, how about companies use some of those work life factors of belonging and trust and meaning, despite the fact that cost efficiencies have forced bean counters to say we've got to reduce headcount by X%, and you're caught up in that shrapnel, that we don't call them fired, we don't call them terminated, but that we've sort of graduated them, if you will, into alumni, just like you might do in a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate in a higher ed. And when you think about the term alumni, that's right away saying I was part of something, but now I'm still part of a community that is post whatever X was.
Right. And you
And
can amplify the network science
yeah,
because all of a sudden you've got a huge number of people who are willing to actually step up and be an advocate for your company and your success. And you see that actually, I think it's Unilever who's actually got that flex program that they're working with. They're actually bringing in retirees and past alumni who maybe want to work part-time, or they want to develop certain skills and they want to work in different ways with the company even after like they've retired, for example, or left the company for whatever opportunity and doesn't necessarily work out, right? So that's where it's almost like a gig economy that you're creating, where you can actually bring people in who have specific skills that are still useful to you, and it's going to be something that actually makes it worthwhile for the company, but also for the people.
couldn't agree more. In fact, that's kind of what I point out in the skills life factor,
Yeah.
is exactly that. So Unilever, Novartis,
Mm.
really two good examples of big organizations that are inculcating a skills-based operating system, as they both refer to it as. And a skills-based operating system is a way in which to tap into the existing talent that's in the organization and finding ways to upskill, reskill in a sort of what I call horizontal ignition way, through gigs, through short-term assignments, through rotations, through projects that might be Tiger Team like, But also, to your point, whether that individual worked for the organization in a previous life and can come back on an alumni gig basis, or just simply having part-time sort of gig workers who might be, quote, retired from even another organization, let alone their own, and coming back and taking on fractional work. This is all about the 1-2 punch, as I point out in the book, between relationships and skills. Like, you can't not have one without the other in this day and age, hence it being a life factor that leaders need to tap into if they want to create the conditions for, their organization to thrive in this day and age where, a lot of people are not thinking about staying with one company for, 17 plus years.
Or those companies may not even exist anymore. I mean, there's so much research that's out there that's saying basically like the companies that are actually Fortune 500 right now, like probably they're not going to necessarily last that much longer, because it used to be companies would last forever, and now the average life expectancy of a company is about 15 years.
Yes, it's dropped as well. I think it
Yeah,
was Fortune 500 50 years ago had a lifespan of 60 years, and it's dropped to 17
yeah.
in the most recent data. And it's like, wow, okay, well, and does it does it matter? That's the other, we get this argument about, is growth good? Is the whole means to an organization growth, or and to thus maintain or achieve Fortune 500 or Fortune 5000 status? I don't know. Isn't EBITDA and profit an outcome of the conditions you create at your organization rather than that being the goal?
Yeah, exactly. But that comes back then to the mission and the purpose and the values and the vision of the business, right? Why are you in business? If purpose is the only reason, that's myopic.
Exactly. You can't have purpose without profit, and ideally you don't have profit without purpose.
Right. Exactly. So I find that very interesting. Have you come across Canadian research for this? Because I mean, we're talking Fortune 500, and obviously in the Canadian world, that's not what we do, right? And companies in Canada tend to be older.
Can you rephrase that just to make sure I understood it correctly so I can answer it correctly?
Have you seen Canadian research that's similar in terms of age of companies? So like I'm thinking like the banks, insurance companies, all that stuff. Those companies are old, and that's the majority of like the large employers in Canada, right?
Yeah, the ROB Report on Business through the Globe did a piece on this. It must have been 2021 now. It took a hard look at the longevity piece, who stayed in the top 50. I think it's top 50 exactly. And the interesting part is exactly that: insurance, banking, telecom were they didn't really change. There's a couple like Loblaw examples, right, that are a little bit more than insurance and so forth, but the there has not been a huge shift here in this country, in Canada at least, from sort of the big players over a period of time.
And why is it so different? Do you think it's just sheer size and business opportunity?
Yeah, partly that. I think partly the old Robin Williams quip, like, what's it like being Canadian and living in Canada? And Robin Williams famously said, Canadians are so kind and nice. They live in the attic over our top of a crack party or a crack house. And that's partly like, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but Canada has to live underneath a giant. And when you have 370 odd million people and the world's number one GDP and economy underneath you, it's at times difficult to distinguish yourself from a business perspective because of just so much cross-border trading that occurs. I don't consider Canada the 51st state by any stretch, by the way, but from a business perspective, there's just a lot of intermingling that goes on, and the need for Canada to disassociate itself from America, I think, is high. So as folks like Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie have been pointingly remarking over the past 10 years or so, we need an innovation engine here in the country if we want to distinguish ourselves and remain untethered from the US.
Yep. Now you like the what is it? Is it Smartless podcast with Jason Bateman and Yeah. Did you ever hear the episode that had Ryan Reynolds in it?
I did.
Did you pick up right at the end when they're talking, they're telling Canada stories, and Jason Bateman finally is like, "Are we still talking about Canada?"
Yes. Well, as we should, though. I
Yes,
mean, I
we should.
often joke that I'm the very ugly Ryan Reynolds. I just want to ensure that we continue to punch above our weight, to distinguish ourselves, and to be proud of being Canadian. There's just so much good that we have done and will continue to do in the country, which is why Work Life Bloom comes out 2 weeks before anywhere else on the planet, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I quite like that. I love that you tagged Ryan Reynolds too, which is why I made a point to mention him. So question for you. You also created a playlist to go along with your marketing initiatives for this. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I'm a thank you for that question. I guess I'm a wannabe DJ. I'm just really trying to be my best version of George Stroumboulopoulos, very famous Canadian, now Apple DJ. I used to DJ weddings. I used to DJ house parties. People would say, "Hey Dan, can you bring your bag of CDs and come over and DJ?" And I would exactly do that. And so it's never left me. I love music of most ranges, maybe not thrash metal, but the playlists are ways for me to think about the music. Sometimes it's what I was using in my studio to write, and sometimes they are just specific about how I'm feeling. And it's just how, blooming is also homage to music. So how might we bloom from an oratory perspective? And the playlists do just that.
Perfect. I was very glad to see Wham represented and Aha because we are the same age. So I was going through your playlist going, okay, yeah.
That's excellent. And again, I like remixes as well. So some of those are, the old days, being a kid from the 80s, the old 12-inch singles. I just loved some of those growing up, and I would scour the planet like Sam the Record Mans and so forth to find these 12-inch singles from the 80s. So good.
Yeah, I love that too. So Sam the Record Man. Oh, I did interview Erica M. You mentioned George, so I'm going to mention
Oh,
Erica.
Erica, good
You have
friend.
to
I
if you
love
listen
Erica.
to one episode of my podcast, go find the Erica M. Leslie M. episode.
Erica and Leslie, what a powerhouse, and their new venture is just amazing. So just love those two. They're amazing.
Yeah, I was the first person to interview them together.
Oh my
That's my claim
gosh.
to fame.
Well, funny Erica's story. Last year, I was, speaking of Canada, I'm at a concert watching 5440,
Yep.
and Neil, the lead singer, basically comes on. It was an acoustic set, the first half of the two sets, and so he comes on. He starts strumming his guitar a little. He starts telling the stories like, and I'm like, I need to record this. I don't know where this is going, but so I start recording it, and he, about 50 seconds in, he's talking about Toronto, how this band from Vancouver and Victoria just wanted to make it, and they're in Toronto. And then there's this young woman who's a VJ at Much Music, whom somehow just decided to like our song. And so she advocated to get this video played, and it got on heavy rotation. So he's leading in, and then he just says, "This song is dedicated to Erica M." And so I'm like, I knew it. And so after he goes into "Hey there, pretty girl," I turn the camera around, I face me, I'm like, "Erica, they just dedicated this to you." And then I click send on a text to her, and it was a little touching moment. Erica's great.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, no, it's quite fun. So yeah. Well, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure that we did?
I think no. First of all, thank you for the invite. Maybe, well, the only other thing would be selfishly to say the Work Life Bloom assessment is available. worklifebloom.com/assessment. Anyone can take it. Find out what you are right now, and don't be beholden to those personas. You might be blooming, you might be stunted, you might be budding, you might be renewal, but that's okay. So worklifebloom.com/assessment. If you're listening. And if you're watching, you can take a QR code snapshot from the screen there as well.
Yeah. Well, like any good garden, there's, seasons. That's what I was getting for. My metaphor is
Exactly
getting
it.
away from me.
All good.
Anyways, thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate the conversation, Nola, and how extemporaneous sometimes we can go and be and learn from one another. So that I appreciate greatly for your candor and your preparation, but also just the tangents we took. I loved it. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. That tangents are right up my alley all the time. Thank you.